Guys. And it's been a series, if you're just kind of joining us, on looking at the lives of the original 12 followers of Jesus. And just the reality of how God worked in the midst of their lives. A bit of a heads up in terms of the next couple of weeks as we're entering into the fall, I should say. Next week, I know summer is a time of people going away and coming back, and perhaps we haven't been here as often as we want on a Sunday morning. But Sunday next week is going to be a family service where we're all going to be together. There will be a nursery provided for those kids up to the age of 4. But all the other kids are going to be here because we're essentially going to have a Sunday morning where we're going to look at what we've been up to at PPC. So we're going to kind of hear from the kids. We're going to hear from some of the other different ministries that have been going on. And so sometimes we wonder, okay, what else has been going on in my absence? Amazingly, this church continues to go regardless if we're here every week. Even when I don't show up, things seem to still kind of run on out. So we're going to learn and just kind of be reminded again of the things that have been happening. And it's exciting to see. A lot of churches at times kind of slow down or are not as active or involved in summer. But I think in summertime, we really kind of ramp it up a little bit. So it's going to be great to see. And then in 2 weeks, we're going to start a new series called I Can't Get No Satisfaction. Anyone know where that line comes from? The Rolling Stones. But before that, it really came from the minor prophets in the Bible. Because one of the constant messages of the prophets is this idea that people seem to want to find satisfaction in life, but they look in all the wrong places. And so this is going to be kind of our shout out to the minor prophets and see, again, this constant thread of the Bible of how God is continually telling us the same message of if you want satisfaction, then begin listening to me. So we're going to start that in 2 weeks. So whether you're a Stones fan or not, this hopefully will still be a series for you. But this week we're going to kind of wrap up a little bit in terms of what we have been learning and looking through the lives of the 12 apostles. And I don't know about you, but for me, one of the great takeaways has been the idea that when we go back and look at who these guys were, we see just incredibly how God used them in spite of their shortcomings. One of the comments that I hear too often, I think, is people saying, well, how can God really use me? What could God do with my life? And my answer is always start reading through the Bible and read it through new eyes as you begin to see not who the people were after they met Jesus, but begin to see who they were before Jesus entered into their life. Because we see the same old story happening over and over again. Individuals who had shortcomings, who had failures, who messed up even while they were with Jesus. Jesus never gave up on them. And Jesus continued to remain faithful to them and use them in just incredible ways. And so it's encouraging for me to be reminded again of how God is still in the business of partnership. He still wants to come alongside and use you and me to build his ministry. Because what's interesting about it is that as people spent more time with Jesus, not only were their lives transformed, but their communities were impacted. And so it always brings us back to the idea of if I want to make a difference in this world, if I want to make a difference in this community, let's begin spending more and more time with Jesus. Not simply on a Sunday morning, not simply at different times in the year, but in the midst of all of life, we see this reality played out. And so we've been going back through this summer and looking at some of the shortcomings of the disciples of Jesus so that we can be encouraged and can be reminded of how God can continue to use us. And so this morning we're going to look at 2 brothers called James and John. And they're referred to at different places in the Bible. They're referred to initially as the sons of Zebedee. And one comment I always make, and it's been pointed out to me, is always notice the details. Because they don't just kind of throw things away and say, well, you know what, James and John, by the way, they're the sons of Zebedee. No, what that would mean is they would have come from a prominent family. They would have been known in the community. There would have been that desire to seek greatness in the midst of life. And so James and John are referred to as the sons of Zebedee. Jesus actually gives them a nickname. And we know sometimes Jesus likes to change people's names. You know, Simon's name was changed to Peter. Well, Jesus gives James and John the translation of the sons of thunder, right? And when you think of thunder, you think of enthusiasm, you think of passion, you think of sometimes going a little bit too far, about being a little bit too overzealous, about just trying to grab things and capture things. And Jesus, when he met James and John, was like, you guys are the sons of thunder. And it was a rather fitting nickname. In Luke 9, there's this story of just how overpassionate they were. Jesus and his disciples are on their way to Jerusalem, and it's a distance to cover, and they have to go through the region of Samaria. Now, for typical Jews, they would go the long route away because they didn't want to go through Samaria to get to Jerusalem. And you can read that and think, why does Jesus tell the parable of the Good Samaritan? And why does Jesus often talk about Samaritans in such a positive way? Because it would have absolutely thrown off his Jewish audience. Because historically in Jesus' day, Jews and Samaritans, how do I put it? Hated each other. Let's just call it that. They absolutely hated each other, and it was historical because during the exile, the Samaritans were those Jews who began marrying into other cultures, who began kind of crossbreeding their worship of God and the worship of other gods. It's not like they didn't stop believing in God. They just thought, you know what? We kind of need some side dishes with God as well. And so they began to kind of intermarry literally, and they began to kind of bring faith together with other pagan gods. And so the Jews saw them as complete sellouts, completely not the children of God. And they would go to whatever length it is to avoid them. And so Samaritans, of course, when someone dislikes you and hates you, our society often says, well, you know what, tit for tat. I will show you the same lack of love. And this built up over years, over decades, over generations upon generations upon generations. And probably younger Jews growing up wouldn't even know why they didn't go through Samaria. They just knew that was no trespassing. Don't go through there. But Jesus says we're going to go through Samaria, and because it's a long journey, we need to find somewhere to stay for the night. So go ahead and make preparations ahead of time. One of the great things about Jesus is he sometimes kind of sets us up for not always the easiest thing to do. So here you are, a young Jewish male who knew his whole life that I don't even want to go to Samaria. Now I got to go and knock on someone's door and say, hey, can we stay here for the night? It's like, Jesus, come on. But what you see Jesus always wanting to do is push us into places of discomfort, to begin to challenge and change our thought process. So these guys go off very obedient, and they show up, and guess what happens? No vacancy signs across the lot. All the Samaritans there's no way we are being hospitable to you. Keep on trucking. And so Jesus arrives with James and John, and they get word of this. And they're like, Jesus, the Samaritans, shockingly, aren't letting us stay with them. And then listen to what James and John suggest to Jesus. They say, Jesus, we got a great idea. Let's call fire down from heaven and just completely smoke them out. Sons of thunder, no kidding. All we're told, unfortunately, is Jesus rebuked them. But I would have loved to have heard that conversation. I'm totally reading into it, but I wonder if it went along these lines. James, John, smoked them? Really? I'm pretty sure I talked about loving your enemies, not smoking your enemies. Who are these guys? And so what Jesus did was he just said, let's just move on. Let's just continue going. And what we see from that story is not only the reality of why they probably got their nickname, but also the reality of so often, even when we're following Jesus, we can still at times fail to fully register and appreciate what he wants from us. And so it's a form of encouragement. Jesus said, you know what, thanks for the suggestion, but no thanks. But Jesus didn't completely give up on them. He said, continue to follow me. And we begin to see a sense of transformation. But this morning, as we look more into the life of James and John, I'm pretty sure that, I didn't want to focus on that story because I'm just assuming that you guys are kind of above that grade, that if someone, isn't kind to you, you don't suddenly say, all right, Jesus, call down fire from heaven. Maybe you do, I don't know, but I don't want to go into that this morning. But there's another issue that James and John struggled with, that I know I struggle with, and I think we all may struggle with as well. And so Karen is going to kind of read the story, and then we're going to unpack it a little bit together.
I'm reading from Matthew 20, verses 20 to 28. It's on page 22 of the New Testament in your pew Bibles. Then the mother of Zebedee's sons came to Jesus with her sons, and kneeling down, asked a favor of him. "What is it you want?" he asked. She said, "Grant that one of these two sons of mine may sit at your right and the other at your left in your kingdom." "You don't know what you are asking," Jesus said to them. "Can you drink the cup I am going to drink?" "We can," they answered. Jesus said to them, "You will indeed drink from my cup, but to sit at my right or left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared by my Father." When the 10 heard about this, they were indignant with the two brothers. Jesus called them together and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." May God bless this reading from his word.
The desire to be great, the desire to be known, the desire to have status when people see you, they stop. It's interesting when we read this account, absolutely the other disciples would have been incredibly annoyed at James and John. I mean, James and John, think about it for a moment. These are grown men, and they have their mother do their bidding on their behalf. They somehow convince their mom to go to Jesus and kneel down and to take the posture of a servant, but in reality, she's asking for something huge. And she says, I have a favor to ask of you. And notice Jesus doesn't say, sure, absolutely. He says, well, what is it? I think there's some good lesson in that when someone comes up to you and says, hey, I have a favor to ask of you, say, okay, well, tell me what the favor is, and then I'll respond. She says, you know my sons, James and John. When you enter into your kingdom, can one of them sit on your left and one of them sit on your right? Essentially, they wanted to ride shotgun with Jesus, right? And if you have kids and you have teenagers, you know there's that desire to be in the front seat, right? Because the front seat is the cool seat. The back seat is the not-so-cool seat. And James and John wanted to sit in the front seat with Jesus because they understood, listen, there's going to be a pecking order in the kingdom of God, right? Jesus is our king. He's our Lord. He's our master. We're not asking for that. But how about second position? Second position, then we're known as the guys with Jesus. They wanted to be known. They wanted to be great. And there's a conversation that happens because sometimes we may just think that Jesus threw all of it in together. But Jesus first said to James and John's mother and to them, says, listen, do you really know what you're asking for? Which indicates that they probably didn't understand all that Jesus was about at this point in time. But then Jesus is like, and they're like, yeah, of course we know what we're asking for. We know exactly what we're asking for. And Jesus is like, I don't think you do. But anyways, it's not for me to grant this on your behalf. And Jesus stops the conversation there. It's only after the other disciples hear what has gone on behind their backs that they become incredibly annoyed. And it's then that Jesus launches into this incredible teaching point where he says, listen, we live in a culture, we live in a society where masters want to lord it over others, We live in a world where it is better to have people serve you than to serve. And Jesus says these words that I just carry with me. I have come not to be served, but to serve and to give my life for others. And I think it's rather fitting that Jesus says that statement only after his disciples all become annoyed, because now he's got his 12. Two of them have really come out and just truly shown their cards as to, listen, Jesus, we want to be known. We want to be great. The others were annoyed because I think they just weren't smart enough to ask Jesus on their own. Because we see in other places, in Matthew chapter 9, the disciples, while Jesus isn't there, are actually arguing over who is the greatest. You know, of course, again, we got Jesus, we're following Jesus, but if we're going to do like a top 10 list, like let's just rank each other out. Who's going to be number one? Who is Jesus' guy? And they're carrying on this conversation. It gets even better in John 13, where at the end of Jesus' ministry, remember, this is at the end of Jesus' ministry, right? Oftentimes we can just kind of blow through the Bible and read through it really quickly, but understand when we read through these pages, this is over a period of weeks, months, and even years. So they have been with Jesus, not for days, not for weeks, for years. And they're in Jerusalem again, in John 13. They're going into the upper room to prepare for Passover. So they have a rented room, which again presents a problem which Jesus would have been aware of. In Israel culture, there was a sign of respect when someone came into your home. Remember, they weren't living on paved streets. They had messy, dirty, dusty streets that were shared with animals. And people wore sandals. And so after a long day of walking down dirty, dusty, stinky streets, guess what? Your feet became dirty, dusty, stinky, smelly, pretty gross. And so the culture of the day was when you walked into someone's house, you would sit down, and not the master, but a servant would come, someone who was told to do it, the lowest of the low. You knew you were at the bottom looking up when you had the role of head foot washer. And so people would come and would wash your feet. That was a sign of hospitality. Have you ever, you don't have to raise your hands for this, but I know God created us, but feet are an interesting body part, right? That's why we cover it with shoes and socks, right? It's just, they're not always pretty, especially my feet. But they get dirty and dusty and stinky, and then to have to wash someone's feet, that's not an easy thing to do. And so here's Jesus with his disciples in the upper room. They're about to prepare for the meal, and they all sit down and look around and realize, slight problem here. Who's going to wash our feet? I wonder what that must have been like. That kind of awkward tension. Everyone looking around thinking, okay, we're going to eye everyone up. You know, the guys who maybe think they're lower down the totem pole are probably looking at the ground thinking, okay, I know everyone's looking at me, but I don't want to do this. And they're looking, and nobody is moving. And before this happens, John gives us this little kind of lead-in narrative. He says, Jesus was about to show them the full extent of their love, of his love. You know, love is that oftentimes that misunderstood word. We think of the warm fuzzies. We think of just the emotional of just, yeah, I can't wait. I'm so excited. I just want to do this. But love is a commitment to often do the things that we don't necessarily want to do. It doesn't always come very naturally to us. And we're told that Jesus was about to show them the full extent of his love. And so the disciples are all sitting there, eyeballing everybody, wondering who's going to wash my feet. Jesus pops up, wraps a towel around his waist, grabs a basin of water, and begins washing his disciples' feet. Jaws must have been hitting the floor. They must have been thinking, oh man, we have blown it yet again. And Jesus uses this as an opportunity to say, listen, this is how you love others. This is what it begins to look like to be a follower of me. You see, going back to that original story, when James and John wanted to be great, Jesus says there is a different way for greatness. There is a different way to show love. You see, unfortunately, in Jesus' day, and I don't think things have changed too much in our day, is that we often use influence and status to serve ourselves as opposed to serve others. Humility is that evasive, just it's elusive in terms of our life. We see humility in others and we admire it, but how does it begin to take root in our own life? What I begin to notice is that to truly begin to follow the way of Jesus, to truly become a humble individual means you don't actually pursue humility. If you think about it for a moment, you think, well, if I want to be more humble, then I will just try to be more humble. But there's a problem in that reasoning, because the more you focus on humility, the more you focus upon yourself. And actually, the less humble you are becoming. And the further down the road is you get into a difficult trap when suddenly if you start saying, well, I'm going to be really humble and I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that, suddenly you start to measure your humility and then you take a step back and think, I'm a pretty humble guy. Look at all that I have done. And then guess what happens? Humility has just left the building. It's like grasping Jell-O. It's difficult to do. C.S. Lewis, I think, and I'm going to throw the quote up here, just defines humility in such a great way. He says, humility is not thinking less of yourself. It is thinking of yourself less. It's a bit of a mouthful, but just let that sink in for a moment. You see, to be a humble individual is not to suddenly kind of beat yourself down, is not suddenly to say, oh, I'm really nothing. No, you go ahead. No, you go ahead, and just always constantly tearing yourself down. That doesn't make you humble. It actually makes you a doormat. At other times, it can actually make you an enabler, right? To be really humble and just say, well, I'm just gonna let them do what they need to do. No, you're just enabling bad behavior. Jesus never just enabled people. Jesus was incredibly humble. But humility is not thinking less of yourself. It's rather not always thinking about yourself. And there's a huge difference. It begins to speak towards the focus of our lives. And what Jesus constantly says is, listen, if you want to become more like me, then focus on me. Because what begins to happen is as we focus more and more upon Jesus, we begin focusing less and less upon ourselves. We begin to recognize not only the example that Jesus gave for us, but we begin to take stock of our lives. And I think one of the struggles that I have in my own life is this level of entitlement. Is this idea of, well, you know, I have got all this in my life because of all of my good choices, because of all the things that I have done. But if you take a step back and begin to take stock of your life, you realize that there's way more at play than just the choices and the decisions that we make. You know, I think too often we just categorically throw it into that one area and say, well, so-and-so is in that lot in life because they have made poor decisions and poor choices. And I'm in this lot in life because I have made good decisions. And that is partially true. But in a great book by Malcolm Gladwell called Outliers, he's a social scientist, he talks about how we are products of more than just the choices we make. Think of your environment. Think of the family in which you were born into. And as a result of that, as a result of your family, as a result of your country, as a result of the environment, as a result of the opportunities you were given, you had a further foot ahead. And so suddenly as you start to focus on Jesus, you start to realize, well, wait a second here. Maybe not everything I have is simply because of the choices I have made. If you were born into a small town or rural town in Malawi, let me say, the choices you make would be very different, the opportunities you'd be given. The second thing I begin to realize is not only are we a product of the environment oftentimes in which we were born into, but just our genetics, our natural talents, our natural abilities, the gifts that we have been given. And suddenly we start to realize that, yeah, we have to use the things that God has given to us, but as we focus more and more upon Jesus, we realize these incredible gifts that God has given to us. And suddenly what it starts to do is it allows us to approach our lives differently, but most importantly, begin to view others differently. You see, the more we focus on Jesus, the less we focus on ourselves, and the more we begin to focus upon others. If you read through any of the Gospels, if you read through any of the teachings of Jesus, the majority of his teachings is about how we are to treat others. And so much of them are tied and linked together with this aspect of humility, of loving your enemies, praying for those who persecute you, giving clothes to the naked, feeding the hungry, visiting people in prison, visiting people who are sick and are ill. It begins to completely change not only how we view ourselves, but in how we view others. What Jesus is showing his disciples, what Jesus is showing you and me, is that there's another type of greatness. There's another way. And Jesus' way is using our influence, using our abilities, not to be served, but in rather to serve. What I appreciate about James and John is that they didn't get it right off the hop. It took months. It took years. But one could say, like a good wine, they aged well because of Jesus. Their desire to seek status, their desire to become great in the eyes of the world was transformed in an ability to serve others. Acts chapter 12 tells us that James was the first of the 12 to be martyred for his faith. A willingness to actually drink of the cup that Jesus had talked about. The willingness to humble himself and to give his life for the sake of another. John became incredibly influential in the early church. He's attributed with having been inspired by God to not only write the Gospel of John, the 3 letters of John, but also the book of Revelation. But John was also one who was exiled for his faith to a small island called Patmos. But he was an individual who was used by God to do great things because he was willing to use his influence for the sake of others. What James and John teaches me, what following Jesus begins to look like, is if we want to be used by God to do great things, we have to stop focusing on ourselves and begin focusing on others. Begin recognizing that our status is not found in simply how great we have become, but rather in who we are in Jesus and how he desires to use us to do great things. I want to encourage you this week to just try a couple of things. The first one is just take some time to read through John chapter 13, the story that I kind of briefly told of Jesus washing his disciples' feet. And just allow that to kind of work into your life. And to allow that to begin to see yourself as one of those disciples of Jesus humbling himself to serve you. You begin to have a different perspective in your day-to-day. And then take the opportunity to see throughout this week opportunities to be great in the eyes of God. They're often subtle, they're often small, but they're opportunities to serve others, to be used by others, to see the influence that you have as an opportunity to build someone else up. You see, we live in a culture that is not unlike Jesus' day, where people are clawing and grabbing to get to the top. But the only way that works is by pulling someone else down. Jesus says, lift another up, and you will be great. C.S. Lewis says, humility is not thinking less of yourself. It's just don't focus so much on yourself. Begin focusing upon the needs of others. And then like James and John, and like countless others, not only will our lives begin to be transformed, we'll begin to shape our communities around us as we build others up, all because of what Jesus has done for us. So let us go out and be great. Let's be great in the eyes of God. Please stand as we sing together.